The question we're going to answer today, here we go. You're a data scientist for Instagram's product team. A product manager proposes changing the platform's messaging system to allow interactions with other platforms and third-party businesses. The question you're going to try to answer today, how would you determine whether this change is a good idea? All right, hi, I'm Lara. I have been doing data science for 10 plus years. I've mentored dozens of students, helped them work through interview questions, and I'm going to show you how we're going to answer this question today. Let's dive into it. To answer this question, the framework we're going to use is called the case study method. It's very frequently used in business schools. And the way that it works is you break down your thinking into a couple of steps. First, you have to cover the background of the problem you're trying to solve. You have to set up a problem statement to think about some metrics that you're going to use in your analysis. And finally, you'll use that analysis to make some recommendations. Best practice when you are doing an interview for a case study is to ask the interviewer for a few minutes to silently collect your thoughts. So it's always good to have a piece of paper, something to write with. So at this time, be a great point to pause the video, spend a few minutes using this framework, write a couple of thoughts, and then come back and see how we solved it. We're using the case study method. The first thing we're going to do is set up a background. It's important to be as familiar as possible with the product before you go into an interview. So whatever company you're interviewing for, make sure you understand how their product works. So for Instagram, that means understanding how the messaging app works. We know that you can send and receive messages from any user on Instagram. It's part of the app and it's part of the website. Some questions that we'd want to ask at this point is, how has Instagram changed its messaging app recently? That would allow us to know what they're prioritizing for their users. So we know that recently there's been a historical shift to using stronger user privacy and protections from spam. For example, if you receive messages from people that you don't follow, they're sequestered to a separate area. That means you have to take a couple of extra steps to even be able to see those messages. There's also been increased control given to users for who can send you messages. So you can decide whether you want messages from people you don't follow, and then you just have more control over those messages. This suggests that Instagram is prioritizing the ability to have control over who messages you. The second question we can ask is, are there any other current integrations with third-party applications that Instagram already has? And the answer to that is yes. Instagram already has the ability to integrate shopping with third-party businesses. You can even check out and do your transaction directly on Instagram. So now we have to think about the question, what is the proposed change from the current situation? And we're proposing to change Instagram's messaging system to allow interactions with other platforms and third-party businesses. To set up a problem statement, you have to make sure that you identify any assumptions that you make and keep any ambiguities and variables to a minimum. Now, in the real world, there may be dozens of different variables and metrics that you have to take into account to answer a question like this. But in an interview, you want to keep the number of variables smaller to something more manageable. It's going to be more important to demonstrate that you can speak logically and intelligently about a couple of metrics rather than to rattle off every different KPI you've ever heard of. So if you have to make assumptions in order to keep the number of variables down, make sure that you state them. The problem statement that we're going to try to answer here is Instagram wants to evaluate the potential benefits and risks of changing its messaging system to interact with third-party businesses. Notice we're talking about both benefits and risks. So any variable that we're going to consider, we want to keep in mind as much as possible the benefits and risks for each of those variables. Now, there are a large number of possible variables you could have come up with in this case. Here, we're going to talk about 5 of them. First, user experience. 2, privacy concerns, particularly any legal or regulatory requirements that Instagram might be party to. 3 is going to be revenue. 4, the technical feasibility of making any change. And 5, whether there's any long-term strategic alignment with what Instagram is doing and this proposed change. All right, let's jump into the analysis. So the first area we're going to look at is user experience. Some things that we might want to do is to conduct surveys and get feedback from our users to understand whether they even want this kind of new change to the messaging system. So it would be pointless to introduce functionality if our users tell us that's not something we'd ever want to use. We then have to think about different ways of evaluating the impact on user engagement and user satisfaction. In this case, the change is going to be so large, it might not work to do an A/B test just because of the amount of engineering that would have to happen on the back end in order to introduce such a new feature. So we're going to have to be a little bit more clever to think about how we could evaluate the impact on users. Using surveys and setting up different feedback mechanisms could be something that we could do. A risk to keep in mind from the user experience side is that if we allow more businesses to contact users on Instagram, there's a potential for their message inbox to become cluttered, or businesses may start spamming users, and that could increase the load on our system, but it could also degrade the experience for the users. Of course, there's a benefit for users if we can figure out how to make this work well, which is that now users would have a seamless experience within a single application, and they'd be able to interact with multiple businesses, and that could induce them to stay on the application longer. Incredibly important is to also analyze how privacy is going to be affected by such a change. So we have to make sure we assess the privacy implications of allowing third-party businesses to access our own users' data. We also have to make sure that we are compliant with any data protection regulations, whether those be in any of the countries that we operate in. So make sure that you think globally, not just the country that you're in. And then we have to make sure we understand how we're going to handle data, how we're going to store that data, how data sharing is even going to happen with our third-party partners. So we have to make sure that also our third-party partners take privacy seriously, and that they also have the means to ensure the protection of user data on their side of the platform. So a huge risk here is that the more integrations that we have, the more points of entry there could be for hackers. The more that there are points of entry for hackers, the more likely it is that our application could be at risk. Not much of a benefit in terms of privacy. This one is pretty strongly a risk. The more that we add to our application, the more privacy implications there are going to be. Always important when you're thinking about whether to change your product is it going to make you more money? So we have to think about revenue. What are the possibilities for revenue generation from adding this new capability? So we have to analyze the potential that we could get for new sources of revenue through these different partnerships. We also have to think about how the revenue share would happen. This is going to be a complicated process to decide if a transaction happens on Instagram, but it happens with Grubhub, how much of that income is Instagram going to keep versus how much of that income is Grubhub going to keep. So there's going to be that revenue sharing component. So we have to consider different models and their potential impacts on Instagram's finances. We also have to keep in mind from the revenue, it's not just, oh, obviously monetization is a good idea. We have to keep user satisfaction in mind. So thinking about the feasibility of monetizing our messaging system, which so far Instagram has not monetized their messaging, and how is that going to impact our users, and will users be satisfied, or will they be a little bit cynical if we introduce monetization to our messaging? So the risk here is that we could lose customers or users who are unhappy if we put monetization in more areas of our product, And then the obvious benefit is that, of course, with more revenue streams, that gives us more opportunities to increase income. Creating a new feature on an application is not an easy task. So there are a lot of technical feasibility considerations we have to think about. We have to think about what are the technical requirements, but also the costs that would come with integrating the messaging functionality with different third-party platforms. And that's the technical feasibility from our side, but also from our partner's side. The more different third-party applications that we're going to try to interact with, the more that there have to be changes to our code base, the more that the technical side of things becomes a little bit more complicated. So we have to evaluate the compatibility with our existing infrastructure and systems. If we have to make changes to it, if we have to upgrade it, what are those costs? In terms of costs, we have to think about the resource requirement, both from a money perspective, but also from a talent perspective. Do we have the appropriate mix of engineers and staff in order to deploy this change? So we have to think about whether we currently have the people who would even know how to do this, add this new feature, whether we'd have to hire new people, and that could be very costly and take a lot of time. Even if we decide that we would make a lot of money and that users would be happy by adding this new feature, we also have to consider the technical feasibility of adding a feature. There is no free lunch. That means that there is no free way to get revenue by adding a new feature. We have to be careful to assess the technical requirements and especially the costs for integrating this messaging function with our third-party platforms. That's not just internal. We have to think external. We have to evaluate the compatibility with the existing infrastructure and systems of our third-party partners. What would be any cost of upgrades or changes that have to be made to our system and to their system? And if our systems are incompatible, we either have to invent a new way for them to talk to each other, or one of the sides is going to have to change their system. The resource requirement too, keep in mind, it's not just about money. It's about time, and it's about, do we have the appropriate talent on staff currently? So the resource requirements for developing, maintaining, and supporting a new feature, we have to ask the question, well, does Instagram have the correct mix of engineers and staff required to deploy this change? Maybe the engineers that we have on staff are very good at doing the product as it already exists, but is there new expertise that would be required for a new feature? And if there is, do we have to hire new people, especially with the increased privacy risks? Do we have to hire more cybersecurity engineers? This all has to be kept in mind because hiring takes a long time and costs a lot of money. A big risk with technical feasibility is technical debt. Technical debt refers to perhaps ways of having created the product in the past that were not optimal. Maybe you had to deliver on a deadline and you did things that were not the most optimal. And so now you have to work within that technical debt. That's a big risk whenever you want to add a new feature to a product, because you have to work within that existing system. There is no possibility, right, of wiping the slate clean and rewriting the code for Instagram from the top. So even if we decide that adding this new feature is going to be feasible from a technical viewpoint, even if we decide we have the money for it, that users are going to love this new feature, we have to answer the question, does it align with Instagram's long-term strategic vision? So we might want to assess whether the change complements existing features, whether it enhances Instagram's competitive position in the market. To do this, we can look at maybe what other apps that are similar to Instagram are doing. Are other players in the market moving in this direction? Now, there may be features where users would think it's super cool to add that capability to the app, but it might not make sense for Instagram as a product. And then we have to also consider the potential impact on retaining our users, whether it will give us an opportunity to grow the platform. So is this going to be a feature that's going to entice maybe new users to the platform? An obvious benefit here is that more features on its face could lead to increased user engagement if the feature is a good idea, right? So the benefit is if we add a feature that users really love, it's going to cause them to come back to our platform. If they feel like, oh, well, I was going to use this third-party application anyway, and now I can do it seamlessly within a single application, I'm going to continue to engage with this product. But of course, there's a huge risk here that if we lose alignment with Instagram's core product, it could confuse users. If they don't understand the draw of our product, then we may see some stagnation in user growth because new users just don't understand why they would want to become users of our product to begin with. We've considered 5 different avenues of analysis, and there could be many more. So if you wrote down some that you didn't see here, those could absolutely be correct. Again, reminder, in a case study interview, you want to make sure that you work with a smaller set of more impactful variables so that you can demonstrate you really understand those variables in depth. After you set up your analysis, you can make some recommendations. So in this case, depending on the outcomes from the different channels and avenues of analysis that we had done, we may consider recommending that this feature be adopted or not adopted. So make sure that you have a clear answer. This would be a great place where you can make some assumptions. You can say, oh, we did some user feedback, some user testing, and all of our users say that they would love this new feature. We looked at our code base. We decided we would be able to technically add this new feature and it would work seamlessly. So make sure that you're very clear in your recommendation. It may include having to make some assumptions. But when you make your recommendation, make sure that you consider potential mitigations for any identified risks and challenges. Remember, in all of the areas of analysis we considered, there were risks for all of them. If you're going to recommend that this feature be added to Instagram, make sure that you can at least touch on how you would mitigate all of those risks that you identify. And then if you do recommend that this feature be implemented, have an idea of a roadmap for how the implementation would be done. So things to think about when creating the roadmap are milestones. So maybe we don't want to have immediate rollout of this feature for every single merchant, every single third-party application, and every single Instagram user. Instead, maybe we want to have smaller milestones. First milestone could be to choose one specific partner that wants to work with us on this integration. And then we could introduce that integration in one market. So for example, just Canada or just the United States. And then make sure that you have success metrics so that you know once you've introduced that feature, you can keep track of whether it's working. So then you can increase the number of partners that you have or the markets where this feature is being introduced into. All right, so that is one way that you could potentially solve this case study. Make sure to let us know if you have other thoughts or other ways that you tried to solve it. You might be wondering, why would you get asked this kind of case study? What would an interviewer be looking for in your answer to such a case study question? It's important to realize there is no one true correct answer. Instagram doesn't really care if you have a perfect roadmap today for them introducing a new feature. What an interviewer is looking for is your capacity to think logically. And you also have to be flexible when you're answering these kinds of questions. In this case, there was no back and forth, but with an interviewer, they may interrupt you. They may ask you follow-up questions. You have to make sure that you don't get flustered. If you need to take a moment, always pause. You can always ask for a minute to collect your thoughts, write down some notes before you answer any questions. So really what an interviewer is looking for here is your understanding of the product. If you're interviewing for Instagram, they want to make sure you understand how their product works, that you understand what users are looking for, and that you also understand the technical side of things, that you can't just, with a magic wand, add a new feature, right? That there are considerations that go into that. So things like security, cybersecurity, regulatory things, technical debt, those are the buzzwords that they're going to be looking for. All right, so here's our solution we're submitting. All right, well, thank you for joining us for this video. If you'd like to see more, join us on Interview Query. The link to that is going to be in the description box below, and hopefully I'll see you in a future video.